My name is Meredith Gallo, I'm 45 years old, and my own sister called the cops on me the day I came home after 25 years of serving my country. Before I tell you how a single dusty ledger from the county archives ended up with federal agents raiding their home, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The taxi pulled away, leaving me on the curb under the heavy, sweet air of a Charleston September. For 25 years, through sandstorms in Iraq and frozen nights in Afghanistan, this was the image I held onto: the grand, white-columned house on Trad Street, the smell of jasmine climbing the wrought iron fence. Home. I was still in my dress uniform, the crisp blue fabric a stark contrast to the humidity that was already starting to cling to my skin. My duffel bag felt heavier than it should, not with gear, but with a quarter-century of silence. My hand, steady enough to defuse a bomb, trembled slightly as I reached for the gate's latch. It didn't budge. I saw the new security camera swivel towards me, its little red light blinking like a judgmental eye. I pressed the intercom. A sharp buzz, then nothing. I pressed it again, my voice rough when I spoke. "Lorraine? It's me. It's Meredith." The front door swung open, not with a welcome, but like an accusation. My sister, Lorraine, stood at the top of the steps. She wore a perfectly tailored linen dress, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. She looked every bit the queen of this castle, and her eyes were pure ice. She already had her phone to her ear. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser," she said, her voice clear and sharp, loud enough for me to hear every word. "There's a woman in a uniform at my gate. She's claiming to be family." It felt like a punch to the gut. The air rushed out of my lungs. "Lorraine, what are you doing?" "It's me." She lowered the phone just enough to glare at me. "This isn't your home anymore, Meredith. You've been gone for 25 years. You don't get to just show up here and expect a parade." Her eyes raked over my uniform, my medals, with a look of pure contempt. "I just got discharged," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I thought I'd see Mom and Dad." A cruel little smile played on her lips. "You should have thought of them sooner. Things have changed. You're not in the will, Meredith. This property, this inheritance, belongs to me now." The word inheritance hung in the air, thick and ugly. I looked past her, through the open door, and I saw him. A shadow moved behind the living room curtains. My father. Arthur. He stood there, watching this whole nightmare unfold, and he didn't move a muscle. He didn't step out. He didn't wave. He didn't even meet my gaze. He just watched as his older daughter was treated like a criminal on his doorstep. The squeal of tires broke the standoff. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, its lights flashing silently. 2 officers got out. One was older, weary. The other was young, barely out of his 20s. The young one spoke first, all business. "Ma'am, we've had a complaint about a trespasser." "This is my parents' house," I said, my voice shaking with a rage I hadn't felt since basic training. "I grew up here." Lorraine glided down the steps, a picture of offended grace. "Officer, this woman is my sister, it's true. But she has no legal claim to this property. She's been unwell since her time overseas. We're all very concerned for her." Unwell. The word was a dagger. She was painting me as unstable, a broken soldier. My blood ran cold. Then it boiled. The older officer looked from me to the house, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said to me, his voice gentle but firm. "Do you have any proof of residence?" Of course I didn't. All I had were my discharge papers and a lifetime of memories they were trying to erase. I took a step back. Then another. The gate felt like a prison wall. As the officers were asking me to leave the premises, I saw it. Tucked into the manicured lawn, almost hidden by a rose bush, was a brand new for sale sign. Not just any sign. It was from a high-end commercial realtor. They weren't just living in my home. They were selling it. They were selling my entire history, my grandfather's legacy, everything. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was a calculated erasure. I gave the officers a curt nod, turned my back on the house, on my sister's triumphant smirk, and my father's silent betrayal. I walked down the street, my mind racing. Wills could be changed, but deeds were public record. I didn't go to a hotel. I drove straight to the Charleston County Records office, the smell of old paper and stale bureaucracy a strange comfort. I needed to see the original deed, the one my grandfather signed, the one that named me. The clerk, a woman named Doris with kind eyes, seemed to sense my urgency. She pointed me to a humming microfiche machine in the corner. My hands were shaking as I threaded the film. I scrolled through years of property transfers, the whirring of the machine the only sound in the silent room. And then I found it. The deed of transfer for the house on Trad Street. The date was from 3 months ago. The seller was listed as Meredith Gallo. And the signature, it was a sloppy, arrogant forgery of my name. Beneath it, a second document. A transfer from my name to a shell corporation I'd never heard of, Palmetto Holdings. I felt a white-hot flash of fury crawl up my neck. They didn't just disown me. They stole my name. They committed fraud. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the linoleum floor. I had the proof. This was the weapon I needed. I turned to the clerk, my voice low and steady, and I said, "Doris," I said, my voice tight, "I need a certified copy of this page. And this one." She looked at the screen, then at my face, and her kind eyes filled with a sad understanding. She simply nodded and got to work. 20 minutes later, I walked out of that building with a manila envelope that felt like a brick of pure truth in my hands. My first call was to Jocelyn Ames, a lawyer my grandfather had always spoken of with immense respect. She was known for being as sharp as a Charleston oyster knife. "Mr. Gallo always said you were the one with the steel spine, Meredith," she said over the phone, her voice a low, reassuring hum. "Get to my office. Broad Street. Now." Jocelyn's office was old Charleston money, mahogany desk, leather-bound books, and a view of the harbor. But there was nothing old about her. Her eyes were piercingly intelligent as she examined the copies of the deeds under a desk lamp. "This is a forgery, and a clumsy one at that," she declared, tapping the signature with a perfectly manicured nail. "And this?" "Palmetto Holdings," she spun around to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Registered 6 months ago. Address is a P.O. box in North Charleston. Single director. Sterling Thorne." My blood ran cold. Sterling. My sister's husband. The slick investment banker who always looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. "He's laundering the property, Meredith," Jocelyn said, her face grim. "He's trying to flip it fast before anyone can catch on. We can file an injunction, freeze the sale. We can sue for fraud, but it will be a fight. A messy, public fight." "I don't care," I said, the words like iron in my mouth. "Let's burn them to the ground." I left her office feeling a sliver of hope for the first time all day. But I had underestimated my brother-in-law. Sterling didn't just play dirty, he invented new ways to cheat. The next morning, as I was sitting in a cheap motel room planning my next move, my phone buzzed with a message from an old army buddy. "Mir, you might want to see this." It was a link to a local gossip blog, the kind that thrives on the scandals of Charleston's elite. The headline made me physically ill. "Local hero's troubled return?" Sources say decorated sergeant forced into early retirement after internal investigation. I clicked on it, my hand trembling. The article was a masterpiece of slander. Anonymous sources close to the family expressed their deep concern for my mental state. It hinted that my 25 years of service had ended not in honor, but in disgrace, following a supposed investigation into the mishandling of sensitive information. It painted me as unstable, unreliable, and a potential liability. It was a character assassination, designed to discredit me before I could even speak. I didn't have to guess who the source was. Sterling's fingerprints were all over it. He wasn't just trying to steal my house, he was trying to steal my honor, the one thing I had left. He was poisoning the well, turning the entire city against me. The motel room suddenly felt like a cage. I walked over to the window and looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I saw the lines of exhaustion around my eyes, the gray hairs at my temples. Was this what they saw? A broken soldier? A liability? No. I saw a fighter. Sterling had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He thought he was just fighting a woman for a piece of property. He had no idea he had just declared war on a sergeant in the United States Army. And I was about to remind him, and my entire family, exactly what that meant. This was no longer about a house. This was about my name. The gossip blog was a low blow, but it was also a tactical error. It showed me Sterling was scared. You only launch a smear campaign when you know your position is weak. I spent the next 2 days living out of my car, a ghost in my own hometown. I parked blocks away from the house on Trad Street, watching, gathering intel just like I'd done 100 times in the field. On the third night, a flicker of movement from the house across the street caught my eye. An elderly man was standing on his porch, watching me. I recognized him, Mr. Abernathy. He'd lived there since I was a little girl. He gave a short, sharp nod, a signal. I got out of the car and walked across the street. "Sergeant Gallo," he said, his voice raspy but firm. He was a Navy vet, Korea. He saw the uniform, not the rumors. "I read that trash they wrote about you. Don't believe a word of it." "Thank you, sir," I said, my throat tight. He looked over at my family's house, his eyes narrowed. "They think no one's watching. Your brother-in-law, Sterling, he's arrogant." Every Tuesday and Friday, just after midnight, a plain white truck, no markings, backs into their driveway. They unload crates. Fast. He's always there, watching, wearing gloves. Something isn't right. The information was a jolt of electricity. This was bigger than real estate fraud. Mr. Abernathy's tip gave me a target. That night, I dressed in black, bought a small, high-fidelity audio recorder, and slipped into the alley behind my grandfather's house. The back garden was overgrown, and a large camellia bush offered perfect cover with a clear line of sight to the driveway. The wait was cold and damp. Just after midnight, just as Mr. Abernathy said, a plain white box truck rolled up the street, its headlights off, and backed silently into the driveway. My heart pounded against my ribs. I activated the recorder. 2 men got out and started unloading wooden crates. They worked with a quiet efficiency that spoke of practice. Then, Sterling emerged from the back door, followed by my father, Arthur. My own father. He wasn't just watching from the window anymore. He was participating. I couldn't hear their words clearly, just low murmurs. I needed to get closer. I crept along the fence line, my body low to the ground, until I was just yards away, hidden behind an old oak tree. The air was thick with the smell of my mother's night-blooming jasmine, a scent from my childhood now tainted with betrayal. Sterling was speaking on his phone. His voice was a low, confident purr. "The shipment is secure. No issues at all. The logistics are clean." Then my father spoke, and his words chilled me to the bone. He was talking to Sterling, his voice tight with anxiety. "What about Meredith? She's not stupid. She was at the records office. What if she keeps digging?" Sterling let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Arthur, relax. The narrative is already set. She's the crazy sister, remember? But you're right, she's a nuisance. He paused, and his next words were low and venomous. If she gets any closer, we'll have to shut her up. Permanently. I froze. It wasn't a figure of speech. The way he said it, the cold finality in his tone, was a direct threat. But it was my father's response that truly broke me. He didn't object. He didn't defend me. He just gave a weak, defeated nod. Just be discreet. I backed away slowly, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the recorder. I got to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had them. I had my father and Sterling on tape, discussing a criminal shipment and threatening my life. The next morning, driven by a cold fury, I went back. I had to know what was in those crates. I approached the alley again, but stopped dead. The camellia bush where I had hidden was trampled. And on the ground, right where I had been kneeling, was a single, pristine white glove, the kind Sterling had been wearing. The recorder was gone. They knew. They knew I was there. They were sending me a message. The missing recorder and the white glove were a clear warning shot. They weren't just trying to scare me, they were showing me they were always one step ahead. I was floored. My best piece of evidence was gone. Back in her office, Jocelyn listened intently, her face a stony mask. They're escalating, Meredith. This is attempted witness intimidation. But without that recording, it's your word against theirs, and they've already poisoned the well with that article. Our investigation into the forged deed hit a similar wall. The notary who had supposedly witnessed the signature, a man named Frank Gable, had passed away 6 months ago from a sudden heart attack. It was all too convenient. Another dead end, I said, rubbing my temples. The frustration was a physical weight. Maybe not, Jocelyn said, her eyes gleaming with a familiar, predatory light. Frank had a legal assistant for 30 years. A woman named Beatrice Gable. His widow. She retired when he died. Lives over in West Ashley. Finding Beatrice Gable's address was easy. Getting her to talk was another matter entirely. She lived in a small, tidy bungalow filled with porcelain dolls that watched me with vacant eyes. Beatrice herself was a frail woman, her hands trembling as she poured me a glass of iced tea. "I'm sorry, I can't help you," she whispered, refusing to meet my eyes. Frank, he handled all the paperwork. I was just his assistant. "Mrs. Gable," I said gently, leaning forward. "The signature on this deed is a forgery. My brother-in-law, Sterling Thorne, is involved. I know you're afraid of him." At the mention of Sterling's name, a flicker of genuine terror crossed her face. She stood up abruptly, her hands fluttering at her throat. "You need to leave. Please. I can't get involved. He's a very powerful man." She was walking me to the door, her movements hurried and panicked. I thought it was over. But just as I stepped onto the porch, she grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "I can't testify," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He'd ruin me. He'd ruin my family." She glanced back into her house, then leaned in close, her breath smelling of mints and fear. "But your grandfather, he was a good man. He always said the truth isn't in the letters people write, it's in the ledgers they keep. The official record. Frank was meticulous. That's all I can say. The ledger. Not the letter." It was a cryptic clue, but it was more than I'd had a minute ago. I drove straight back to the county records office, my mind racing. "What ledger?" Doris, the clerk, looked up as I practically ran to her counter. "I need to see the official property transaction ledgers for the year 2017, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The physical books." She frowned. "Honey, all that's been digitized. It's on the microfiche." No, I insisted, a gut feeling taking over. The clue was about the ledger, the book itself. The one the notary would have brought here in person. Please. It's important. Perhaps she saw the desperation in my eyes. She sighed, then disappeared into a back room. She returned a few minutes later, covered in a fine layer of dust, carrying a massive, leather-bound volume that looked like it belonged in a museum. The spine read, Charleston County Property Transfers, 2017. My heart pounded as I laid it on the table. The pages were thick and yellowed. I spent the next 3 hours hunched over that book, my fingers tracing lines of faded ink, the smell of old paper filling my lungs. I went through every single transaction, my hopes starting to fade. And then I saw it. November 10, 2017. An entry for the property on Trad Street. It was a transfer of deed upon death. My grandfather's signature was there, bold and familiar even in faded ink, transferring the house to me, Meredith Gallo. It was the original, legal inheritance. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the page. And there, on a separate page dated just 3 months ago, was another entry for the same property. This one was a quitclaim deed, transferring the house from Meredith Gallo to Palmetto Holdings. The entry was written in a different pen, the handwriting slightly off. And next to my forged signature was the signature of the witness, Frank Gable. But it wasn't his signature. After staring at his real signature for hours, I knew. This one was a fake, too. But the final, damning piece of evidence was in the notary's stamp. The ink was slightly smudged, but the registration number was clear. Out of a desperate hunch, I pulled up my phone and looked up the state's notary database. I typed in the number. The result came back instantly. Notary registration #78 before 52, cancelled. Holder deceased. November 12, 2024. The stamp they used to notarize the forged deed, the one that stole my house, had belonged to a dead man. I had them. I had the smoking gun. I took a photo of the ledger with my phone, my hands perfectly steady. The hunt was over. Now, the war would begin. Armed with a certified copy of the ledger page, I felt like I finally had solid ground beneath my feet. But I knew the fraudulent deed was just the tip of the iceberg. The question was, what was Sterling hiding, and why go to such extreme lengths? For that, I needed more than a lawyer. I needed my old team. That night, I initiated a secure video call. 2 faces popped up on my encrypted laptop screen. One belonged to Dexter, a hardware genius who could make a supercomputer out of a toaster. The other was Piper, a network analyst so good she could probably hack into the afterlife. They were the best intelligence analysts I'd ever worked with, and more importantly, they were loyal. "Mir, you look like hell," Piper said, her fingers already a blur across her keyboard. "What's the situation?" I gave them the rundown, the disinheritance, the forgery, the shell company, the threats. I sent them the files on Palmetto Holdings and the name Sterling Thorne. For a moment, there was silence. Then Dexter whistled, low and long. "Sterling Thorne. That name rings a bell. Give me a minute." He disappeared from the screen, the sound of furious typing in the background. Piper, meanwhile, was already deep inside the web. "Palmetto Holdings is a ghost," she said, her eyes locked on her screen. "But ghosts leave trails." I watched, mesmerized, as she worked. Lines of code scrolled past. IP addresses were traced and discarded. She moved through digital firewalls like they were made of smoke. "Got it," she said, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. "The P.O. box for Palmetto is a dead end, but the registration fee was paid with a credit card. A corporate card. Registered to Thorne Financial Group." "Sterling's company," I breathed. "Bingo," she said. "And Thorne Financial is the parent company for about a dozen other LLCs. All registered offshore. This guy isn't just hiding a house, Mir. He's running a whole shell game. She pulled up a series of financial transfers. Money was flowing from these LLCs into Palmetto Holdings, then out again to various suppliers. He's using the house as a physical base for some kind of logistics operation. Those crates Mr. Abernathy saw, this is where the money for them is coming from. Just then, Dexter's face reappeared on the screen. He looked pale. Mir, you're not going to like this. I ran Sterling Thorne through an old Department of Defense contractor database. He's not listed as a primary, but his name shows up as a financial consultant for a company called March Solutions. My stomach dropped. I knew that name. March Solutions. They were bidding on a supply contract for drone parts back in 2016. They were disqualified. Rumor was they submitted forged compliance reports. It was more than a rumor, Dexter said grimly. He shared his screen. On it was a heavily redacted internal report. They weren't just forging compliance, they were using substandard parts. A whole batch of surveillance drones we flagged during your deployment in the Gulf went missing after an audit. The case went cold. Someone upstairs buried it. It was all clicking into place, a horrifying puzzle. They needed access to get those contracts, I said, thinking aloud. They needed clearance. Piper's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence. Oh my God, Mir. I'm in Thorne Financial's internal server. I found a subfolder labeled Special Projects. It's encrypted, but the file names, there's one here. Gallo_clearance_profile.pdf. I felt the room spin. They used my security clearance. That's how they got back in the game. They used my name, my reputation. But it was the next discovery that shattered me completely. Piper had cross-referenced the financial records for my father, Arthur Gallo. What she found was a portrait of a man in ruin. A string of failed investments. A mountain of debt. His business was on the verge of collapse, threatening to drag the family name through the mud, the one thing he cared about more than anything. And then, a single, massive wire transfer. 6 months ago, just before the deed was forged. A payment of $2 million into Arthur Gallo's personal account, clearing all his debts. The source? One of Sterling's offshore LLCs. It wasn't just greed. It was desperation. Sterling hadn't just manipulated my father, he had bought him. He had offered my father a deal to save his precious family name, and the price was his own daughter. My father hadn't just stood by and let it happen. He had taken the blood money. He sold me, my home, my inheritance, and my honor, all to cover up his own failures. The revelation about my father's betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow. It was a cold, hollow feeling that settled deep in my bones. For a moment, I just sat there in the dark motel room, the glow of the laptop screen lighting up the faces of my friends. They were silent, giving me the space I needed. Finally, I took a deep breath. The grief was still there, but something else was rising to meet it, a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just about Sterling's crimes. It was about my father's choice. He sold me, I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. He sold me to save his own pride. What's the play, Mir? Dexter asked quietly. We're done with local, I said, my voice gaining strength. This is a federal case now. Defense contract fraud, identity theft involving a security clearance, money laundering, this is FBI territory. Jocelyn agreed without hesitation. The next morning, we weren't at the local courthouse. We were walking into the J. Waddy's Waring Judicial Center, the federal building downtown. I had swapped my uniform for a simple, professional suit, but I carried myself with the same military bearing. I was no longer a victim, I was a federal witness. We sat in a sterile conference room with 2 FBI agents. One was a younger man in a crisp suit, all business. The other was an older agent, a man named Patterson, whose tired eyes had seen everything. I laid it all out, from the forged deed to the defense contract fraud. I presented the ledger, the financial records Piper had uncovered, and Dexter's analysis of the drone parts case. Patterson listened without interruption, his hands steepled under his chin. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute. Then he looked at the other agent. "Get a warrant for the house on Trad Street. And I want full financial subpoenas for Sterling Thorne, Lorraine Thorne, Arthur Gallo, and every single one of those shell companies. Now." He turned back to me. "Sergeant Gallo, you've done our job for us. Thank you for your service, again. The federal machine, once it starts moving, moves with terrifying speed and efficiency. They advised me to lay low. The raid on the house was scheduled for 2 days later. But the subpoenas were to be served immediately. And the FBI, it turned out, had a flair for the dramatic. I got the first call from Jocelyn, who was getting real-time updates from Agent Patterson. "You're not going to believe this," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "They just served Sterling." Sterling Thorne was the keynote speaker at the Charleston Annual Investors Gala, a black-tie event held at the city's most exclusive hotel. He was mid-sentence, pontificating about fiscal responsibility, when two quiet, imposing men in dark suits walked onto the stage. They weren't hotel security. They were U.S. Marshals. One of them handed him a thick envelope. In front of 200 of Charleston's wealthiest citizens, Sterling Thorne was served with a federal subpoena. The room fell into a dead silence, broken only by the frantic clicking of a few journalists' cameras. His empire of arrogance began to crumble right there on that stage. The second call came an hour later. Lorraine was hosting her monthly charity book club luncheon at a private club downtown. It was the height of social respectability. As she was discussing the finer points of some best-selling novel, the same two marshals walked into the private dining room. They handed her the subpoena just as she was lifting a teacup to her lips. The cup clattered into its saucer, splashing tea onto the pristine white tablecloth. The carefully constructed facade of the perfect Southern hostess shattered in front of all her friends. But the third delivery was the one I thought about the most. There was no audience for this one. No public humiliation. Just a single U.S. Marshal knocking on the door of the grand house on Trad Street. My father, Arthur Gallo, answered the door. He was alone in the house he had stolen from one child to please the other. The marshal handed him the envelope. The document inside didn't just demand his testimony, it demanded every financial record he had from the last 10 years. It demanded he explain the $2 million payment from Sterling. It demanded he face the consequences of his choices. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept in a real bed in a hotel room Jocelyn had booked for me under a false name. But I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about that knock on the door. The sound of a life, of a family, imploding under the weight of its own lies. 2 days later, at dawn, I was sitting in an unmarked car with Agent Patterson a block away from the house. We watched as a team of FBI agents, clad in tactical gear, swarmed the property. It was quiet, efficient, and overwhelming. They used a battering ram on the front door my sister had closed in my face. They were inside for hours. When they finally emerged, they were carrying boxes. Evidence boxes. Crates. The same crates Mr. Abernathy had told me about. Patterson's phone rang. He listened, then grunted. "You were right, Sergeant. The crates weren't full of drone parts. They were full of cash. Millions of it. Unmarked bills. He was using the house as a drop point to physically launder the cash from his offshore accounts." He hung up and looked at me. "Your brother-in-law wasn't just a fraud. He was running a full-scale money laundering operation right under everyone's noses." I just stared at the house. The home of my childhood, the place I had dreamed of for 25 years, had been turned into a criminal way station. The sale of the house wasn't just about the money from the property itself, it was about erasing the evidence of their operation. They needed to get rid of it before someone, me, came looking. Patterson's phone buzzed again. It was a text. He read it and a slow, grim smile spread across his face. He showed me the screen. It was a message from the lead agent inside the house. We found the safe. You need to see this. Inside a hidden wall safe in my father's study, they had found more than just financial documents. They found the original copy of my grandfather's will, the one that left the house to me. And clipped to it was a handwritten note from my father to my sister. The note read, "Lorraine, burn this after you read it. This is the only copy. Once it's gone, she has no proof. The house is yours. Dad." He hadn't just gone along with the plan. He had been an active, willing conspirator from the very beginning. The last shred of pity I might have had for him vanished. He wasn't a victim of Sterling's manipulation. He was his partner. The weeks leading up to the preliminary hearing were a blur of legal preparations. Sterling and Lorraine had lawyered up with the most expensive firm in Charleston, the kind of lawyers who charge by the second and specialize in making federal crimes look like minor misunderstandings. My father, surprisingly, had a separate, less flashy public defender. The cracks in their united front were already beginning to show. The day of the hearing, the federal courtroom was packed. The story had exploded in the local press, a juicy tale of betrayal among the city's elite. I saw faces from the country club, from Lorraine's charity circles, all whispering behind their hands. I sat at the prosecution's table with Jocelyn and the assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Carter. Across the aisle sat my family. Sterling looked arrogant, whispering confidently to his lawyer. Lorraine was a nervous wreck, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. And my father just looked old and broken. He wouldn't look at me. The prosecution laid out the case with cold, brutal efficiency, the money laundering, the shell companies, the defense contract fraud. But Sterling's lawyer was slick. He was trying to pin everything on a few rogue employees, painting Sterling as an oblivious victim of his own company's success. It was Lorraine's lawyer who went for the jugular. He was trying to discredit me, their star witness. He called Lorraine to the stand. She walked up, radiating a fragile, wronged woman energy that was pure performance. "Mrs. Thorne," her lawyer began, his voice dripping with sympathy, "can you tell the court about your sister's return to Charleston?" Lorraine dabbed at her eyes with the handkerchief. "We were so worried," she sniffed. "Meredith, she wasn't herself. All those years in the service, it changes a person. She was unstable, paranoid. She made all these wild accusations." "And what about the house?" the lawyer prodded. "Did you steal her inheritance?" "Of course not," she cried, a perfect imitation of outrage. "Meredith told us years ago she never wanted it. She hated Charleston. She wanted us to have it, to keep it in the family. This whole thing is a fantasy, a story she concocted because she's angry and unwell." Then Carter, the prosecutor, stood up for cross-examination. He let her spin her tale of concern for a few more minutes before he moved in for the kill. "Mrs. Thorne, you claim your sister is mentally unstable. Is that why you and your husband launched a public smear campaign against her the day after she returned?" The lawyer objected. The judge overruled. Lorraine stammered, We were just concerned." "Concerned?" Carter pressed. "Or were you afraid she would expose your criminal enterprise?" Lorraine's composure finally snapped. The fragile victim disappeared, replaced by the vicious, entitled woman I knew so well. Her face twisted in a sneer. "She has no proof of anything," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She's a liar. She's nothing. She's a disgraced soldier who was thrown out of the army, and she's just jealous of what we've built." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The lie she and Sterling had planted was now being used as a weapon in open court. It was the moment they had been building towards. I felt every eye in the room on me, judging, wondering. I looked at the jury, and I could see the doubt in some of their faces. I didn't flinch. I just looked at Carter and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Carter walked back to his table. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to present one final piece of evidence regarding the fraudulent transfer of the property on Trad Street. He didn't pick up a file or a photograph. He picked up the massive, leather-bound county ledger I had found in the archives. It was so heavy he had to carry it with two hands. He walked over to the witness stand and placed it in front of Lorraine with a heavy, definitive thud that echoed through the silent courtroom. Mrs. Thorne, Carter said, his voice dangerously calm. This is the official Charleston County property ledger from 2017. I have it open to the page documenting the transfer of your grandfather's house. Could you please read the name of the recipient, as designated by your grandfather's own hand? Lorraine stared at the page, her face draining of all color. She looked from the book to her lawyer, to her husband, her eyes wide with panic. She was trapped. I can't read it from here, she stammered. Allow me, Carter said, turning the book so the jury could see. It says, to my beloved granddaughter, Meredith Gallo. His actual signature is right here. And on the next page, we have the forged document you created, using the notary stamp of a man who was already dead. He wasn't done. He turned to the judge. And regarding the defendant's slanderous claim about Sergeant Gallo's service record, he produced a letter, sealed with the official crest of the Department of Defense. This is a letter from the Secretary of the Army himself, confirming Sergeant Gallo's exemplary, unblemished 25-year record and her honorable discharge with full commendations. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Sterling was on his feet, his face purple with rage. Lorraine looked like she was about to faint. The judge slammed his gavel. Silence. His eyes, however, were not on the crowd. They were on Sterling, on Lorraine, and on my father. He had seen enough. He had seen the depth of their conspiracy and their willingness to destroy a decorated soldier's reputation to cover their tracks. He looked at the U.S. Marshal standing by the doors. His voice was cold as ice. Lock this courtroom, he declared, his voice ringing with authority. U.S. Marshals, on standby. Nobody is leaving. My father, who had been silent the whole time, finally shut his eyes. My mother, sitting in the front row, let out a choked sob and buried her face in her hands, begging for it to stop. And my sister, Lorraine, the Queen of Trad Street, just sat there, her jaw dropped, her lies finally, irrevocably, silenced. The judge's order hung in the air like a death sentence. The click of the courtroom doors being locked was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The preliminary hearing was over. The judge declared there was more than enough evidence to proceed to a full federal trial. Bail was denied for Sterling, deemed a flight risk. Lorraine and my father were released on a high bond with ankle monitors. Their world had shrunk to the size of their own homes. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion implosion. The family's assets were frozen. The house on Trad Street, now a federal crime scene, was seized. The story was on every news channel, the gossip blog's slanderous article now held up as proof of premeditated malice. Friends abandoned them. Business partners cut ties. The perfect life they had built on a foundation of lies was swept away like a sandcastle in a hurricane. The day before the trial was set to begin, I was leaving Jocelyn's office when I saw him waiting for me by the elevators. My father. He looked like a stranger. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was gaunt, and the confident, commanding presence he always had was gone, replaced by a desperate, hollowed-out look. Meredith, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. I just looked at him, my face a blank mask. I had nothing left to say to him. Please, he begged, taking a hesitant step forward. Don't do this. You can stop this. Tell the prosecutor it was a misunderstanding. We can pay you back. The house, the money, everything. I laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. Pay me back? You think this is about money? You think you can write a check and fix this? It was Sterling, he pleaded, his eyes searching mine for any sign of the daughter he once knew. He pushed me into it. I was in debt, I was going to lose everything, our name. Our name? I repeated, my voice dangerously low. You cared more about the family name than your own daughter. You stood by while they forged my signature. You stood by while they planned to shut me up. You wrote that note, Dad. The one they found in the safe. Burn this. You weren't a victim. You were a co-conspirator. Tears welled in his eyes. I made a mistake, Mir. A terrible mistake. But I'm your father. Please, don't destroy what's left of our family. I looked at him, at this shell of a man, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hatred. I felt nothing. Just a vast, empty space where a father's love should have been. You did that yourself, I said quietly. You, Lorraine, and Sterling. You destroyed this family the moment you decided my life, my service, and my inheritance were disposable. You have to live with that. I pressed the elevator button and stepped inside, not looking back as the doors closed on his crumpled face. The trial itself was almost a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented the case with surgical precision. The ledger. The offshore bank accounts. The DoD report on the drone parts. The note from the safe. One by one, the nails were hammered into their coffins. Sterling's defense was arrogance. He tried to claim he was a brilliant financier playing by different rules. The jury saw him as a common thief in an expensive suit. Lorraine's defense was tears. She tried to play the manipulated wife, a victim of her husband's ambition and her father's weakness. The jury saw her shrieked accusation in the preliminary hearing, and they saw a spiteful, jealous woman. My father's defense was silence. He pled the fifth. He sat through the entire trial with his eyes closed, as if he could make it all disappear by simply not looking. The jury saw a coward. When it was time for the verdict, the courtroom was still. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, stood up and handed the slip to the clerk. On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, we the jury find the defendant, Sterling Thorne, guilty. A ripple went through the room. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant, Sterling Thorne, guilty. On the charge of identity theft, we find the defendant, Sterling Thorne, guilty. And so it went, down the line. Lorraine was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. My father was found guilty of conspiracy and accessory to fraud. The sentencing came a week later. The judge was unsparing. He spoke of their greed, their arrogance, and most of all, their cruel and calculated betrayal of a family member who had spent her life in service to the country. Sterling Thorne, the judge's voice boomed, for your role as the architect of this conspiracy and your flagrant disregard for the laws of this nation, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison. Sterling's face went white. He looked like he'd been slapped. Lorraine Thorne, for your active and enthusiastic participation in this fraud, and for your malicious attempt to destroy your sister's reputation, I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison. Lorraine let out a strangled sob and collapsed against her lawyer. Then the judge turned to my father. Arthur Gallo, he said, his voice laced with contempt. You betrayed your own daughter. You valued your name over your family, and in the end, you have lost both. For your crimes, I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison. My father didn't react. He just sat there, a statue of regret. It was over. Justice, swift and final, had been served. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Charleston sun. The press swarmed, shouting questions, but I ignored them. Standing on the steps, waiting for me, was a small group of men and women. They were older, wearing faded caps that said Navy, Army, Marines. Mr. Abernathy was among them. He stepped forward and extended a hand. "We're proud of you, Sergeant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Another veteran, a woman with a kind smile, simply said, "Welcome home." Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed for months finally pricked my eyes. This was my family now. This was my community. This was home. In the end, I never moved back into the house on Trad Street. The legal battle returned the property to my name, but the place was tainted. The memories of my childhood were now overlaid with the ugliness of betrayal. It wasn't a home anymore, it was a monument to my family's greed. I hired a realtor and sold it. The Charleston real estate market was hot, and the house, despite its notorious history, sold quickly. When the check cleared, I didn't feel a rush of victory or wealth. I felt free. Free from the weight of that house, from the ghosts of who my family used to be. I took a significant portion of the money and established a trust fund. Not a college fund for nieces or nephews I would never see again, but something better. It was a fund dedicated to providing legal aid for veterans who were being cheated out of their benefits or facing unjust legal battles. The Gallo Veterans Justice Fund. I had taken the name my father was so desperate to protect and given it a new meaning, one rooted in honor and service, not secrets and shame. The rest of the money I used to buy a small, quiet piece of land up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was the opposite of the Charleston house, simple, private, with a view of nothing but trees and sky. It was a place to heal. But the real victory, the one that mattered more than any house or any amount of money, came about a month later. I received an official-looking envelope from the Department of Defense. My hands were steady as I opened it. It wasn't a legal document. It was an invitation. The letter invited me to a private ceremony at the Pentagon. It turned out that my case, and the slanderous lies Sterling and Lorraine had spread, had attracted attention at the highest levels. They weren't just content to see justice served in court, they wanted to publicly reaffirm my honor. I flew to Washington, D.C. and walked the familiar, hallowed halls of the Pentagon. In a small, formal ceremony attended by generals and high-ranking officials, the Secretary of the Army himself presented me with a commendation medal for integrity and moral courage in the face of profound personal adversity. He gave a short speech, condemning the despicable attempt to slander the name of a decorated American soldier and reaffirming the Army's unwavering support for its veterans. There were no news cameras, no press releases. It wasn't for the public. It was for me. It was the Army's way of saying, "We see you. We know what you did. We honor you." After the ceremony, an aide escorted me to the National Cryptologic Museum. "There's something else we wanted you to see," he said. He led me to a new wing, one dedicated to intelligence officers who had made significant contributions during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there, etched into a polished black granite wall, was my name. Sergeant Meredith Gallo. U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command. For distinguished service in signals intelligence and analysis. I stood before it, my reflection a faint ghost on the stone. This was the inheritance my grandfather had truly wanted for me. Not a house, not money, but a legacy. A name synonymous with honor. My family had tried to erase my name, to strip it of all value. But here it was, carved in stone, a permanent part of my country's history. I reached out and touched the cool, smooth letters of my own name. The anger, the pain, the years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, it all just washed away. They hadn't destroyed me. They had revealed who I truly was. I wasn't just Arthur Gallo's daughter or Lorraine's sister. I was Sergeant Meredith Gallo. And I was finally, truly, home. Thank you for listening to my story. It was a long and painful journey, but it's one I needed to share. Have you ever had to fight for something that was rightfully yours, even against the people you were supposed to trust the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if my story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more.